It is a sound that usually signifies safety, rescue, or the arrival of the wealthy elite. The rhythmic thrum of rotor blades slicing through the heavy grey air of the British countryside. But on a freezing afternoon in North Yorkshire, that sound signalled something else entirely. It was the sound of an invasion. To the casual observer, the white Robinson R44 helicopter descending toward the manicured lawns of a secluded holiday park looked innocent enough. Perhaps a high-flying executive arriving for a weekend of golf, or a celebrity seeking privacy away from the prying eyes of London. But the cargo on board wasn't golf clubs or designer luggage. Stuffed into the cramped fuselage pressed against the pilot's seat were bags heavy with the distinct chemical brick weight of high-purity cocaine. This wasn't a transport, it was a pipeline. A literal air bridge connecting the drug superhubs of mainland Europe directly to the veins of the United Kingdom, bypassing the ports, the scanners, and the sniffer dogs that guard the island's borders. For months, this ghost flight had been the golden ticket for a gang from the Wirral, a group of men who believed they had solved the ultimate puzzle of drug trafficking. They thought they had found a way to walk through walls. But as the skids of the helicopter touched the damp grass, the silence of the rural retreat was shattered, not by the greeting of business partners, but by the concussive boom of stun grenades and the roar of engines. Unmarked vehicles tore across the turf. Men in black tactical gear, the elite interceptors of the National Crime Agency, swarmed the aircraft before the rotors could even spin down. The pilot froze. The ground crew, caught dragging millions of pounds of narcotics from the cabin, scrambled in vain. In seconds, the illusion of invincibility evaporated. They had mastered the logistics, they had the money, and they had the nerve. But they had forgotten one thing. In the world of high-stakes aviation, you are never truly invisible. All it took was a single deviation, a momentary lapse in discipline, a blip on a screen that should have been there. This is the story of the helicopter gang, the men who tried to fly an empire under the radar, and the single pilot's error that brought them crashing down to earth. To understand how a group of criminals ends up renting helicopters to smuggle class of drugs, you have to look at the evolution of the trade itself. For decades, the entry point for cocaine into Britain was the sea. Shipping containers docking in Felixstowe, hidden compartments in lorries crossing via Dover, or speedboats making midnight runs across the Channel. But as technology advanced, so did the border force. Scanners became more powerful, intelligence sharing became sharper, and the traditional routes became a gauntlet. For the ambitious criminal, the sea was becoming a choke point. Enter the Wirral syndicate. Based in Merseyside, a region with a long, hardened history of organized crime, this group wasn't interested in the scrap fighting of street-level dealing. They were wholesalers, logistics experts. They understood that the real money wasn't in the gram sold on a street corner in Liverpool, but in the kilo brought safely across the water. They were led not by a chaotic thug, but by minds that thought in terms of supply chains and risk management. They looked at the map of the UK and saw what the police saw, a fortress. But then they looked up. The sky, specifically the uncontrolled airspace over the rural south and north of England, was vast, open, and largely unpoliced. If you fly low enough, if you stay away from the major airports, the sky is effectively a dark highway. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of hiding the drugs, they would simply fly over the walls. The architect of this operation, Lance Kennedy, was a man who understood the value of diversification. He wasn't content with the slow, high-risk grind of road transport. He wanted speed. He wanted a method that could move product from the stash houses of Belgium to the streets of Britain in under 2 hours. To do this, the gang recruited a specialist. They didn't just need drivers, they needed a pilot. They found their man in the form of a Dutch national, a pilot who knew the skies of Europe, and crucially, knew how to fly dark. The method was terrifyingly efficient. The pilot would rent a Robinson R44 helicopter, a popular, relatively affordable light aircraft from a flight school or rental agency in Belgium. He would file a flight plan that looked legitimate. perhaps a local tour or a transit to a nearby airfield. But once airborne, the plan would change. He would dip the nose, dropping the altitude until the helicopter was skimming the treetops, flying below the effective floor of military and civilian radar. He would cross the English Channel at its widest, most desolate points, vanishing into the radar clutter of waves and shipping traffic. On the UK side, the ground crew operated with military precision. They wouldn't meet in dark alleyways or industrial estates that was too cliché, too hot. Instead, they utilized the booming market of luxury holiday rentals. They booked secluded cottages, country estates and golf resorts in Kent and North Yorkshire. These locations offered two things: privacy and space. A helicopter landing on the back lawn of a rented country manor doesn't look like a drug deal, it looks like the arrival of a wealthy guest. It was camouflage in plain sight. The ground crew, driving hire cars registered in seemingly innocent names, would arrive a day early. They would prep the landing zone, checking for unwanted attention. When the chopper arrived, the transfer was done in seconds. The pilot would touch down, the doors would fly open, and bags containing 40, 50, sometimes 60 kilos of high-purity cocaine would be thrown into the boot of a waiting BMW or Audi. Within minutes, the helicopter would be airborne again, heading back to the continent, and the car would be merging onto the A1, just another vehicle in the flow of traffic. It was a perfect loop. Clean, fast, and seemingly untraceable. For a long time, it worked. The gang moved an estimated £500 million worth of cocaine into the UK. They flooded the markets of the Northwest, supplying lower-level gangs across Liverpool, Manchester, and beyond. The money was astronomical. We are talking about profit margins that rival the biggest tech companies in the world. Kennedy and his associates lived the lives of ghosts, washing their money through complex networks, staying one step removed from the dirty work. They believed they had beaten the system. They believed that by taking the high road, they were untouchable. But in the world of organized crime, success is often the precursor to failure. The sheer volume of their success meant they had to fly more often. The trips became routine. And routine breeds complacency. The investigation, codenamed Operation Cobolt by the National Crime Agency, didn't start with a dramatic tip-off. It started with data. Border Force officials, tasked with monitoring the integrity of the UK's airspace, began to notice anomalies. Radar is a tricky thing. It's not a perfect eye, but it records ghosts. Analysts began to see a pattern of unidentified flights appearing and disappearing near the south coast. A blip that would vanish near the cliffs of Dover and reappear 40 minutes later, heading back towards Belgium. It wasn't enough to arrest anyone, but it was enough to spark curiosity. Who flies a helicopter into the UK, lands in a field for 5 minutes, and leaves without filing a proper entry plan? The NCA began to pull on the thread. They looked at the flight paths. They looked at the times. And then, they started looking at the ground. Surveillance teams were deployed. It was a massive undertaking, a game of cat and mouse played out across hundreds of miles of British countryside. Detectives had to predict where the next landing would be. They analyzed the pattern of holiday rentals. They looked for bookings made by men with histories of minor criminality, men who had no business renting a £2,000 a week lodge in the middle of nowhere. They tracked hire vehicles, watching them drive hundreds of miles from the northwest to the southeast, sitting idle in rural lanes, waiting. The breakthrough came when the gang, drunk on their own success, decided to shift their operations further north. They began targeting airfields and locations in North Yorkshire, likely thinking the heat was too high in Kent. But by moving the operation, they extended the flight time, and they extended the window of exposure. The pilot, confident in his skills, began to cut corners. He flew the same routes. He used the same entry points. He trusted his radar shadow too much. But the NCA was already listening. They had managed to encroach on the encrypted communications of the lower-level members. They knew a drop was coming. They knew the date, and they had a probable location, a secluded holiday park near the one motorway. The trap was set. It was a logistical masterpiece of law enforcement. Armed units were moved into position days in advance, hiding in the tree lines, disguised as hikers or workers. Drone units were on standby. They had to be perfect. If they moved too soon, the pilot would see them and abort, turning back to international waters where UK police had no jurisdiction. If they moved too late, the car would be gone, lost in the motorway network. They needed to catch them in the act of transfer. The day of the raid was tense. The weather was far from ideal, with low cloud cover and biting winds, the kind of weather that grounds amateur pilots. But for a smuggler, bad weather is good cover. The NCA commanders watched their screens. The radar blip appeared. It was the white Robinson R44. It was flying dangerously low, skirting power lines and wind farms, a testament to the pilot's skill and recklessness. On the ground, the reception committee waited. The hire car, a silver BMW, pulled onto the grass verge of the holiday lodge. The boot was popped open. Two men stood by, smoking, checking their phones, oblivious to the fact that 50 meters away, scoped rifles were trained on their chests. The sound came first. The chop-chop-chop of the blades echoing off the nearby hills. The helicopter swooped in, flaring hard to bleed off speed, hovering for a moment before settling onto the grass. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. In broad daylight, with holidaymakers potentially nearby, they were conducting a multi-million-pound drug deal. The pilot kept the rotors spinning a hot extraction. He didn't intend to stay for coffee. The men on the ground ran to the aircraft. The door slid back. They began hauling heavy, taped blocks of cocaine out of the cabin. Strike, strike, strike. The command came over the radio. The peace of the countryside exploded. Police vehicles, their lights off until the last second, roared out of concealment. Stun grenades were deployed, creating disorienting flashes and bangs that stunned the smugglers. The pilot, seeing the rush of armed figures, instinctively reached for the collective to lift off, to power away. But it was too late. An armed officer was already at the door, weapon raised, screaming for him to kill the engine. To lift off now would be suicide. The police were too close. The rotors slowed. The whine of the turbine died. The pilot raised his hands. On the grass, the ground crew were face down in the mud, cuffs ratcheting tight around their wrists. Inside the helicopter and the car, officers found the haul. It wasn't just a few bags. It was a mountain of cocaine, kilogram after kilogram of white powder, stamped with the logos of South American cartels. The street value of just this one shipment was estimated at nearly £10 million. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. As investigators picked through the debris of the operation, they found flight logs. They found GPS data. They realized this wasn't a one-off, it was a daily service. The helicopter had been back and forth, like a commuter train. The aftermath of the raid rippled through the underworld. The arrest of the pilot and the ground crew provided the NCA with the intelligence they needed to go after the top of the pyramid. Lance Kennedy, the mastermind, was eventually tracked down. He had been directing the operation from abroad, believing distance would protect him. He was extradited to face justice. The court case was a formality. The flight paths, the rental agreements, the phone data, and the sheer physical bulk of the drugs seized left no room for defense. The judge, in passing sentence, described the operation as an attack on the integrity of the United Kingdom. Kennedy was handed a massive prison sentence, removing one of the country's most sophisticated criminal minds from the board. The pilot, the man whose skill had enabled the whole enterprise, was also jailed for decades. His error hadn't been a crash or a mechanical failure. His error was predictability. He had underestimated the patience and the capability of the people hunting him. He thought the sky was big enough to hide in. he forgot that even the sky is watched. The helicopter gang serves as a stark reminder of the lengths to which organized crime will go to feed the market. It showed that the war on drugs is no longer just fought on the streets or at the docks. It is a three-dimensional battle that takes place in the clouds. For the residents of that quiet corner of North Yorkshire, the raid was a shock, a sudden intrusion of a violent world into their peaceful lives. But for the NCA, it was a victory of intelligence over brute force. They proved that no matter how high you fly, you eventually have to land. And when you do, they will be waiting. The white helicopter, once a symbol of the gang's ingenuity, now sits in a police impound, a grounding wire for a criminal empire that flew too close to the sun. The silence has returned to the countryside, but the eyes of the law remain fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next blip, the next ghost flight, the next error. Because in the game of high-stakes smuggling, the house always wins eventually,